the,
No.
the nature of a tyrant is a tyrant, and then
Mhm.
the pattern of God leading a people away from the tyrant, a righteous remnant would be repeated multiple times. And so I can see where Nephi and others would apply Isaiah to them, at least in part, if not the entire prophecy.
Yes, and you have your tyrants in the Book of Mormon as well.
Yeah.
In Isaiah's day was the king of Assyria, and it's interesting because you look at the attributes of the king of Assyria. He's an antichrist, basically. He's the end time king of Assyria. Is not nothing to do with anything in the ancient Near East. It's a modern ruler of Russia or something like that, who arises and claims to be the god of this world, as Isaiah paints him as such. In chapter 14, he's a man, but he eventually dies, and his corpse lies disfigured upon the earth, eaten by worms. I mean, it's a literal person. So when you look at the attributes of this Antichrist, this king of Assyria of the end time, his attributes are the same attributes as the wicked. So anything that is anybody who's not of God, he's emulating the attributes of the Antichrist. There's word connections, different specific links between the two. And the same with, the Holy One of Israel, the Valiant One of Israel. Those who emulate him are called the Valiant Ones and Holy Ones of God, of Israel in the book of Isaiah. So there are very specific instances where they emulate what he does. Those are great archetypal figures, as well as being literal people.
Let's talk a little about your translation of Isaiah and why people should use that to study. We've talked about this in past podcasts, but it's probably helpful for people watching this that are just kind of new to that idea.
When I was learning Isaiah, when I was in rabbinic school in Israel, we studied it. We studied the actual Hebrew scripts, and then coming into the church after that, I realized, you know, that's not what Hebrew is saying, that the King James is saying. And in fact, I've considered that my first task if people are going to understand Isaiah, they're going to have to understand it not in the King James translation. In fact, I don't know anybody who's understood Isaiah through the King James translation. It's so combobulated here and there or that. I mean, it's beautiful, beautiful, picturesque type English, but that doesn't help you translate necessarily or interpret. So that was the first task I set myself. Could I translate it into knowing Hebrew very well, and also teaching at BYU Hebrew when I came here, even during my bachelor's program, later all the way through my later programs? Could I translate it into Hebrew, into modern English, from Hebrew to modern English, and still be true to the Hebrew? Brigham Young said if anyone could translate the Bible better than the King James, he's under obligation to do so. So I thought, well, I can, possibly. And so I did. I started it during my master's program, finished it in my PhD program. And I spent a whole year doing that. I asked for a blessing. I was given the blessing by my eldest quorum presidency. There were 3 BYU professors, an elder at that time in the church. And they blessed me with the gifts of Oliver Cowdery to translate word verbatim out of the Doctrine and Covenants. And so as I started in on translating, I definitely received helps. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night with something. That particular thing needs attention. I was given the words. Even so, I had dictionaries, lexicons, concordances, all the Hebrew texts that I could muster, plus 12 modern translations of Isaiah in English, laid across a large table, and I'd check every single word except prepositions, word for word. That's why it took over a year to make sure that I had it right as man could make it, even though it's not perfect, but it's as good as I can do. And also there were instances where other translations got stumped because they were into their own theologies, and so they interpreted things from their perspective that were not correct. But because they believed in a certain direction, they would translate it like that anyway.
Was it during this time of doing this translation work, or just later in your PhD when you discovered kind of the literary structure of Isaiah?
It was soon after that because after I finished the translation, I located in Toronto, Canada with Professor Roland K. Harrison, the most famous conservative Old Testament scholar of that time, and studied with him for a year there in Toronto. And that's where I learned a lot of things that have opened up Isaiah. Number one was a literary structure that was discovered by a colleague of Roland K. Harrison named William Brownlee, and he had found in the Dead Sea Scroll of Isaiah from St. Mark's Monastery. There's a complete Dead Sea Scroll of Isaiah, besides the one that's in the Hebrew Museum in Jerusalem, that there was a break in the middle of Isaiah. After the first 33 chapters, there was a little gap. And then the next 33 chapters, it was 66 chapters total. And so then he noticed that there was similarity between the first part of each of the three halves of Isaiah, chapter 1 and chapter 33, and he started following those things. He found there were 7 different parts or genres in each half of the book of Isaiah that matched each other like parallels. And he thought it was just a parallel structure because Hebrews love parallelism, right? You need to learn about that when you start studying Isaiah. The importance of parallel structures and chiastic structures, chiasms, and all of these structures have their own message over and above what you read on the surface. The Book of Mormon has dozens of chiasms that I found years later when I was working on that translation into modern Hebrew for the church. So he kind of left it though. He left it there and didn't research it further. But R.K. Harrison said, "You've got to analyze this for your PhD," and so I did. And that's when I discovered, no, that was not just a parallel structure. That was a whole. That's what I call the 7-part structure nowadays. That transforms the entire book of Isaiah into a end time scenario because it's synchronous structure. Everything that's in that book of Isaiah and within those 7 parts that underlay the whole book of Isaiah, they are saying something that they're teaching a theology from one part to the next to the next. They're teaching a theology that develops like a systematic theology based on God's covenants with the house of Israel and with Abraham and with King David and his heirs. The book of Ether is a second witness of how God acts in history.
Yeah.
And how he acted, and he wiped out the Jaredites, or they wiped themselves out. And so did the Nephites get themselves wiped out by the Lamanites. And it's a warning, as Moroni lets us know in no uncertain terms, for us Gentiles, end-time Gentiles, which we are by definition in the Book of Mormon, called Gentiles, but a specific category of Gentiles, the fullness of the Gentiles, which is the seed of Ephraim. At the same time, yes, it's Moroni's warning to us. Hey, he's seen in vision. They've all seen it in vision. What's going to happen to us? As happened to the Jaredites and the Nephites. And the only ones that are going to survive physically are the literal lineages of Israel, the Jews, the 10 tribes, and Lamanites, and those who are numbered with them. What happens in the second half is not just parallel what happens in the first half of those 33 chapters, right? The first 33 chapters are divided into 7 parts, quick review. And the second half of the book of Isaiah, those 33 chapters are divided into the same 7 parts. Not necessarily the same number of chapters, just 7 parts, each with its own genre. Well, what happens is that ideas that are established in the first half are developed further in the second half and brought to their conclusion. So you might say the first half of Isaiah is putting in all the seeds. But even there, you develop from from the first to the 7th part. But in the second half of Isaiah, all those ideas that are established in the first half are developed further to their climax or utmost and full flowering in the second half. And what are those ideas? Well, those ideas are an end-time prophecy, very explicit about an end-time scenario, political and spiritual, it happens, and the theology that's happening behind the scenes, both among those who are destroyed, who inherit God's covenant curses, and and those who live up to their end time callings and get with the Lord's program and stop watching TV and movies and sports games and put away those idols and take on their end time missions of restoring the house of Israel among us, and the house of Israel itself then responding to those Ephraimite Gentiles serving as spiritual kings and queens and coming into the gospel and being restored as God's covenant people at the end time. That is the great calling we have that Isaiah teaches in that 7-part structure. And it's totally mind-blowing because it attacks prophecy in such a way as we Gentiles or people not acquainted with the Hebrew methodology or the plan of the Jews, it totally blows us away because it's a whole new paradigm. So you've got to be open to learning that paradigm in the first place and then taking it on, because if we don't take it on, it's not going to happen and the Lord cannot come. It's like he couldn't come to Enoch's Zion until Enoch had succeeded with his people that repented of those 7 nations in state of abomination to become a Zion people. Once they were, then the Lord came and dwelt among them. And so it's the same scenario for us. It's another parallel. You talked about parallel histories, and Enoch's Zion establishment is another one of those that is a type and pattern for our day.